Her name was Amara Osai, and she had been playing the violin since she was 4 years old. She did not grow up in a house with a grand piano in the living room or a music teacher on speed dial. She grew up in a small apartment in East London, where the walls were thin and the neighbors knocked when her practice ran past 9 at night. Her mother worked double shifts at a care home, and her father had left when Amara was 6, so there was no one sitting in the front row of her early performances except her grandmother, who would clap loudly and out of rhythm every single time. None of that stopped Amara. If anything, it pushed her forward with a kind of quiet stubbornness that people who grew up comfortable rarely develop. By the time she was 17, she had earned a partial scholarship to attend the Whitmore Youth Orchestra program, one of the most competitive youth music programs in the country. The program was based in a converted Victorian building in central London, all high ceilings and echo-filled rehearsal halls, the kind of place that made even experienced musicians feel slightly small. Amara arrived on the first day with a second-hand violin case held together with electrical tape and a pair of shoes that were 1 season behind everyone else's. She noticed both of these things immediately. She also noticed that she was one of only 3 black students in the entire program. A fact no one mentioned out loud, but that sat in the room like furniture. Everyone had agreed to walk around. The program was led by a man named Victor Hale. He was in his late 50s, classically trained in Vienna, and had conducted orchestras across Europe before settling into this role. He was not a cruel man, not in any obvious way, but he had a particular kind of confidence that comes from spending decades being the smartest and most experienced person in every room he entered. He made decisions quickly. He formed opinions faster. And once he formed an opinion about a musician, it calcified almost immediately into something close to fact, at least in his own mind. He believed he could assess a player's ceiling within minutes of hearing them perform, and he had been right often enough that no one around him had the courage to tell him about the times he had been wrong. Amara had not been in the program for more than 2 weeks when Victor made his first judgment about her. It happened during an open rehearsal session, a low-pressure afternoon where students were invited to try out pieces they were working on independently. Most students played safe choices, well-known concertos, crowd-pleasing movements from composers whose names carried weight. Amara had chosen to attempt the opening of Bartók's Violin Concerto No. 2, a fiercely technical piece that many professional violinists found demanding. She had been working on it for months in her apartment, playing softly after 9 so the neighbors would not complain, listening to recordings through earphones at night before she fell asleep. She did not get far into it before Victor raised his hand and stopped her. He did not do it unkindly. He tilted his head slightly, pressed his lips together in the way he did when he was about to deliver what he considered honest feedback, and told the room, in a tone that was measured and almost gentle, that this particular piece required a level of technical maturity and emotional control that took most players years beyond her current stage to develop. He said it was admirable that she was attempting it, but that perhaps she would be better served by building on a stronger foundation before reaching for something so demanding. He suggested a few alternative pieces. He moved on. The other students in the room looked at Amara or looked away from her, both reactions carrying the same weight. She stood at the front of the rehearsal hall with her bow still in her hand and her violin tucked under her arm, and she nodded. She said, "Okay," quietly. She walked back to her seat. She did not argue. She did not cry. She placed her violin carefully back in its taped-up case and spent the rest of the session listening to others play. But something had shifted in her that afternoon. It was not rage, not exactly. It was closer to a decision. She had grown up hearing versions of the same message delivered in different voices and different rooms. The message that said the thing she was reaching for was a little too far, a little too ambitious, a little beyond where someone like her was supposed to arrive. Each time she had heard it, she had used it the same way, as fuel, Not the loud, explosive kind. The slow-burning kind that keeps a fire going through the night without anyone noticing until morning comes and the warmth is still there. She went home that evening and practiced the bardock for 4 hours straight. Her grandmother sat in the kitchen reading a magazine and occasionally called out that the playing sounded beautiful, even though she could not have told you who bardock was if someone had asked. Amara barely heard her. She was somewhere else entirely, inside the music, inside the problem, working through each phrase with a precision and a fury that had no audience and needed none. She had 3 weeks before the program's first formal showcase. 3 weeks to show Victor Hale and everyone else in that echo-filled hall exactly what he had gotten wrong. The 3 weeks that followed were not romantic in the way that training montages in films tend to be. There was no swelling background music, no slow-motion footage of Amara's bow moving across strings in golden afternoon light. There was just a small bedroom, a second-hand music stand, a violin that needed new strings she could barely afford, and a girl who woke up before 6 every morning and played until her fingers ached, and then played some more. She kept a notepad beside her stand where she wrote down every section that gave her trouble, every phrase she stumbled through, every measure where her timing slipped or her intonation went slightly flat. The list was long at first. She worked through it line by line, the way her mother worked through a pile of laundry, steadily and without complaint, until the pile was gone. What most people at the Whitmore program did not know about Amara was that she had a teacher, though not in the traditional sense. His name was Roland, and he was 71 years old, a retired session musician who had spent decades playing in recording studios and theater pits across London. He had never attended a conservatoire and had no formal credentials that would impress anyone at Whitmore. He charged Amara almost nothing for lessons because her grandmother had once looked after his wife during a difficult illness, and he considered the lessons a form of repayment that he would never fully settle. He worked out of a spare room in his terraced house in Lewisham, where the walls were covered in framed concert posters, and the carpet had not been replaced since the 90s. Roland was the one who had first introduced her to the Bardock Concerto. He had played her a recording 2 years earlier, and when he watched her face as she listened, he had said, quietly, that he thought she would be ready for it before most people expected. He had been preparing her for it ever since, not rushing, but not holding back either. When Amara called him the evening after Victor Hale had stopped her mid-performance and told her she was reaching too high, Roland listened to the whole story without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that the most dangerous opinions in music are the ones delivered with the most confidence. He told her to come over the next morning and they would get to work. The sessions with Roland in those 3 weeks were different from anything they had done before. He pushed her in ways that were uncomfortable and precise. He made her play single phrases 20 times in a row, not to perfect them in an empty mechanical way, but to find the feeling inside them, to understand what Bardock was reaching for emotionally in each movement, and to let that understanding travel from her brain down through her arm and into the bow. He told her that technical ability without emotional honesty was just noise arranged neatly, and that Victor Hale, whatever his credentials, had made the mistake of hearing only what her hands were doing and missing entirely what her instincts were capable of. There were moments in those weeks when doubt crept in anyway. It tends to do that regardless of how determined a person is. There was a Tuesday evening when nothing was working, when the third movement felt impossibly tangled, and her fingers would not cooperate no matter how slowly she took it. And she sat on the edge of her bed with the violin across her knees and stared at the wall for a long time. She thought about Victor's face when he had raised his hand to stop her. She thought about the other students in the room and the direction their eyes had moved. She thought about whether she was doing this to prove something to him or to prove something to herself, and she was not entirely sure the answer was clean or simple. Her grandmother appeared in the doorway at some point during that silence, holding 2 cups of tea, and sat beside her on the bed without asking any questions. They sat there together for a while, not talking, just drinking the tea, and then her grandmother patted her knee once and said, in Twi, a phrase that roughly translated to something like, "The tree does not apologize to the wind for standing firm." It was something her grandmother said often, in various contexts, and it did not always land the way it was perhaps intended, but that evening it landed exactly right. Amara finished her tea, picked up the violin, and went back to the stand. By the end of the second week, something had changed in the way she was playing. It was not a dramatic transformation. Roland noticed it first. The way the phrases were beginning to breathe properly. The way she was no longer fighting the music but moving with it, trusting the places where it wanted to go instead of gripping too tightly. He said very little about it directly, which was his way of saying something significant. He adjusted a few small technical points, reminded her about the position of her elbow in a particular passage, and sent her home early one evening, telling her she had done enough for the day and that rest was also a form of preparation. The showcase was announced for a Friday evening. Students would perform in front of the full program faculty, invited guests, and a handful of external observers who attended these events to scout for talent. The program circulated the running order 2 days before the event. Amara's name appeared near the middle of the list, which meant she would not be opening the evening and would not have the advantage of going last. She would simply have to walk out when her name was called, in front of everyone who had been in that rehearsal hall 3 weeks earlier, and play. Victor Hale's name appeared at the bottom of the running order as the evening's presiding conductor and final commentator. He would be the last voice anyone heard, and he had already made up his mind about what she was capable of. The Friday evening arrived the way important evenings always do, without any particular fanfare, just an ordinary day that happened to carry an extraordinary amount of weight. Amara woke up that morning and did not practice. Roland had told her not to, had been firm about it in the way he was firm about things that matter. He said that the work was already done, and that the day of a performance was not for adding anything new, but for trusting everything that had already been built. She ate breakfast with her grandmother, who made her eggs and toast without being asked, and told her she looked beautiful, which had nothing to do with the performance but was exactly the right thing to say. She arrived at the Whitmore building an hour before the showcase was scheduled to begin. The entrance hall was already filling with people, faculty members in professional clothes, parents with programs folded in their hands, the kind of external observers who carried an air of quiet evaluation wherever they went. Amara signed in at the registration table, collected her performer's badge, and made her way to the warm-up room that had been set aside for students preparing to go on. Several other students were already there, running through passages, shaking out their hands, doing the small rituals that musicians develop to manage the particular anxiety that lives in the hour before a performance. She found a corner of the room and opened her case. The violin looked the same as it always did, familiar and slightly worn, the wood darkened in places from years of handling. She tightened her bow, rosined it carefully, and then stood quietly for a moment with the instrument in her hands before she began to play. She did not run through the Bartok. She played something slow and simple instead, a short piece Roland had taught her years ago, something he said he used to play whenever he needed to remind himself why he had chosen music in the first place. It had no famous composer attached to it. It was just a melody, warm and unhurried, and it settled something in her chest that had been slightly tight since she woke up. Victor Hale came through the warm-up room briefly, as he always did before these events, offering a few words to each student. When he reached Amara, he paused, looked at the case beside her feet, and asked what she had decided to play for the evening. She told him the Bartok Concerto, first and third movements. Something moved across his face, not quite a frown, not quite surprise, something in between that he controlled quickly and replaced with a professional neutrality. He said he hoped she had prepared thoroughly, and she said that she had, and he moved on to the next student. The exchange lasted perhaps 15 seconds. It contained an entire conversation underneath it that neither of them acknowledged out loud. The showcase began at 7. Amara sat in the audience for the first half, watching the other students perform. There were genuinely talented musicians in the program. She had never doubted that, and several of the early performances were polished and assured. A boy named Theo played a Brahms sonata with a maturity that surprised even the faculty members in the front row. A girl named Priya performed a contemporary piece with a kind of fearless precision that drew the loudest applause of the first half. Amara watched and listened and did not compare herself to any of them, which was something Roland had coached her on carefully. He had told her that comparison before a performance was a form of self-sabotage dressed up as preparation. When the interval arrived, she went back to the warm-up room and sat alone for a few minutes. She thought about her grandmother in the audience, who had taken the bus across the city in shoes that hurt her feet because she would not have missed this for anything. She thought about Roland sitting in his house in Lewisham, who had told her he would be listening in spirit, which she understood to mean he was too nervous on her behalf to attend in person. She thought about the 4-year-old version of herself who had first picked up a violin in a community center and immediately refused to put it down, to the bafflement of everyone in the room, because something in the sound had reached into her and claimed her completely, before she had the language to explain what that even meant. She was called to the stage 12 minutes into the second half. She walked out into the light the way Roland had always told her to, not hesitantly and not with theatrical confidence either, but with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged exactly where she was standing. The hall seated around 200 people, and most of the seats were filled. She could see her grandmother in the third row, already sitting forward slightly, already ready to clap at the wrong moment, already the person Amara loved most in any room she had ever performed in. She placed her feet, settled her bow, and looked out at the audience for one still moment before she began. Victor Hale was seated at the end of the front row with a program in his hand, and his legs crossed, and his expression arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who had already made his assessment and was simply waiting for the performance to confirm it. She lifted her bow to the string, and then she began to play. The first note she drew from the violin was not tentative and it was not showy. It was simply true, full and resonant, and placed with the kind of precision that does not come from 3 weeks of preparation, but from 13 years of loving something so completely that it becomes part of the way you breathe. The opening of the Bartók concerto is not a piece that eases you in gently. It asks something of the player immediately, a kind of emotional exposure that has nowhere to hide behind technique alone. Amara did not hide. She played the opening passage with a clarity and a feeling that made 2 people in the second row look up from their programs within the first 30 seconds and not look back down again. Victor Hale uncrossed his legs. What happened in the next 3 minutes was not magic, though some of the people in that hall would later describe it that way when they talked about the evening. It was not magic. It was the result of years of quiet, unglamorous, unwitnessed work finally arriving in a room large enough to hold it. Amara moved through the first movement with a control and an expressiveness that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than technique, the way certain performances do when a musician has stopped performing and started simply telling the truth through their instrument. The phrases she had played in her bedroom 100 times, the passages she had written on her notepad as problems to be solved, the sections Roland had made her repeat until the feeling inside them was as clear as the notes themselves. All of it came together in that hall as something unified and alive and completely her own. The audience was quiet in the way that audiences only go quiet when something is happening that they did not expect. It was not the polite quiet of people being patient. It was the absorbed quiet of people who had forgotten they were sitting in chairs. Amara's grandmother, who had never once managed to hold still through any performance she had attended in her life, sat without moving in the third row with her hands clasped in her lap, and her eyes fixed on her granddaughter, with an expression that needed no translation in any language. Victor Hale had both feet on the floor now, and the program he had been holding was resting on his knee, unread. He was watching her the way he had not watched her 3 weeks ago in the rehearsal hall, when he had raised his hand and stopped her and delivered his careful, confident, completely mistaken assessment of what she was and was not capable of. He was watching her the way he watched musicians he respected. He was watching her the way a man watches something that has quietly corrected him without raising its voice. She moved into the third movement with the same grounded sureness she had carried through the first. The third movement of the Bartok Concerto asks something different from the player than the first does. Where the opening demands a kind of raw emotional honesty, the third demands precision and stamina, and the ability to sustain feeling across a long arc without letting it collapse into sentiment or rigidity. It was the movement Roland had worked hardest with her on, the one she had sat on the edge of her bed struggling with on that Tuesday evening when everything had felt impossible. She played it now as though that Tuesday had been necessary, which it had been, as though the difficulty had been part of the preparation rather than an obstacle to it, which it also had been. When she drew the final note and lifted her bow from the string, there was a half-second of complete silence in the hall. Not the hesitant silence of an audience unsure how to respond, but the full silence of a room that needed one shared breath before it could do anything else. And then the applause came, and it was not polite and it was not measured. It began in the middle rows and spread outward and upward, and within seconds the hall was entirely inside it. Several people stood. Her grandmother was already on her feet before most people had finished processing what they were clapping for, hands raised, clapping in her own particular out-of-rhythm way that Amara had been hearing since she was small, and that she heard now, even above everything else, as clearly as if they were the only two people in the building. Amara stood at the front of the stage and let the applause settle over her. She did not punch the air or break into a wide theatrical smile. She stood the way she had walked out, quietly and with certainty, and she bowed once with genuine gratitude and straightened up again. She looked at the front row. Victor Hale was standing. He was not smiling broadly, and he was not performing a reaction for anyone around him. He was simply standing and clapping, and his face carried the particular expression of a person who has encountered something that has genuinely moved them and has not yet decided what to do with that fact. After the showcase ended and the hall began to empty into smaller conversations and the low, warm noise of an evening winding down, Victor Hale found Amara near the side of the stage where she was packing her violin away.